In this video, we're going to look at signs in the sky. As we see on the screen here, we have Luke 21:25 from the Net version. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and on earth nations in distress, anxious over the roaring of the sea and the surging waves. And I would just point out quickly that this seems to be more than even the worst tsunami. This is a tossing back and forth, and there are other verses that speak of the earth reeling like a drunkard or like a hut swaying in a strong wind. This is extraordinary, humongous tsunamis, if you want to call them that. But the signs we're looking at are more about the ones in the sky, and yet they are here in conjunction with the ones in the sun, the ones in the sky, and the ones on the earth are being happening at the same time. So we have to remember the context of biblical signs. And I want to show you a title of a video, a recording that was made recently by J.D. Farag, Do They Know Something We Don't?, where he goes over all the coincidences, if you want to call it that, of the fact that not only is this eclipse 7 years after another eclipse over the U.S., and the two paths form a giant X that meets at the New Madrid fault line, and there was a third one, lesser known, in between the two that together forms kind of a letter A, or some people will say it's more like the Aleph in Hebrew, and that this is significant, and that there's all these names of towns called Nineveh along the new path, the one that's going to happen on April 8th of 24. But is this really a biblical thing to say? You know, it's certainly something we should pay attention to. We are supposed to know the signs of the times, which, of course, in Jesus' context of saying that, where he was berating the Pharisees, or people in general actually, for not knowing the time of their visitation, the time that the Messiah would come to them, because they didn't know the signs of the times. They could tell what the weather would be like that day, but not where they were in history. So signs have a variety of purposes, but as it's been pointed out also in the J.D. Farag video, and I've pointed out many times before, a sign points to something that hasn't yet happened. So when somebody starts to say that there are signs that occur, such as series of blood moons that occur before an event and sometimes after, that after is the, pardon the pun, red flag, because signs point to what's coming, not what has been. And so if something is a sign, we know it hasn't happened yet, and there's an awful lot of force fitting that goes into the blood moon theories, in my opinion. But as I put in the description of the video here, whenever we see the word sign in Scripture, we must always ask, of what? Are these eclipses, blood moons, and constellations positioned with other events in the sky or on the earth prophetically significant? That's the question we're going to try to answer. And keep in mind that correlation is not causation. That was a phrase made famous, I think, by Carl Sagan, and it actually holds true most of the time. I mean, you can't say just because something happens the same time as something else that it is a cause and effect relationship. And so we always need to consider also, it's similar to Bible codes, where it's actually something called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, where you draw the target after the shots have been fired and try to claim how accurate you were. And it's the same thing with blood moons and a lot of other things. But with Bible codes and things like that, it's also problematic because people tend to rely on that. And like I said, there's been a lot of force fitting. So the fact that these two eclipse paths over the U.S., and with all these towns named Nineveh along the second path, or the third, I guess, doesn't really mean something. Is it significant? But more importantly, is it significant biblically? And as I said in the description, the key is predictability, because a sign is supposed to predict something, not something ordinary. And it's just correlation that there may or may not have been blood moons before or after significant events in history, while at other times more significant events, especially regarding Israel, have been ignored as far as any correlation between blood moons, because there just weren't any. And these more significant events should be the ones there should have been signs for. So consider all of those things when you hear theories about these events in the sky, especially. And as I said, you can get more details about what's making the rounds on the internet from J.D. Farag's video on how people are drawing a lot of conclusions. There's a parallel series of coincidences regarding two American presidents, Lincoln and Kennedy, where, for example, Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy and Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. And there's a long list of uncanny coincidences, but it meant exactly nothing. But this is the Bible we're talking about, so we need to look at what the Bible says on these issues of signs in the sky. We're starting with Genesis 1:14, and God said, "Let there be lights," or luminaries, "in the expanse," or the firmament. The Hebrew word is rakia, the Greek word is stereoma. And as I've said before, it indicates in all its contexts something hard, strong, crystalline, something that like you would hammer out like metal. Doesn't mean it's made of metal, but it's strong like that and shaped like that. Lights in the sky to separate day from night, and let them be signs to indicate seasons and days and years. So remember, we were asking signs of what? It says right here, of seasons and days and years. Now, the word for seasons, we can look at, let me see if I have a link for that, which I'm pretty sure I do. I just didn't remember if I had this prepared. And this is a verse-by-verse commentary on that passage. And it says, if we can scroll down here a little bit, we've got a whole bunch of commentaries to look at. Clark's commentary, and sometimes they're going to have a lot of assumptions of standard cosmology and bowing to what is called science. But we'll have to look past that and stick to our point here. And Clark says one principal office of these luminaries was to divide day and night. When night is considered a state of comparative darkness, how can lights divide or distinguish it? The answer is easy. The sun is the monarch of the day, which is the state of light, of the moon of night, the state of darkness. The rays of the sun falling into the atmosphere, blah, 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 blah. You can, they try to make a scientific or astronomical explanation, but I want to focus on what they say about signs, and we'll look at a couple of other of these commentaries here. Let them ever be considered as continual tokens of God's tender care for man and as standing proofs of his continual miraculous interference, for so the word oth in Hebrew is often used, and is it not the almighty energy of God that upholds them in being? The sun and moon also serve as signs of the different changes which take place in the air and which are so essential for purposes of agriculture, etc. So these are ordinary signs. The sun and the moon are not omens. They're simply telling you when to plant, when to harvest, when, to do various things. And in the case of the Jews, when to have certain festivals, which are based on these things. And so they look at the luminaries to know what time of year it is, to tell them when to have certain appointed feasts. And that's what the basis of the Hebrew word is about appointed times, not just seasons, but appointed times. And they go into that here, Moadim, for the determination of the times which the sacred festival should be held. And just because this is given in Genesis doesn't mean that before there was a nation of Israel that people practiced these festivals. Because remember that Moses is writing the Pentateuch, starting with Genesis, of course, and describing things in terms that the people of Israel would understand, such as when it describes the rivers flowing from the Garden of Eden in terms of nations that were familiar with the people at that time, not necessarily what they were called before the flood or anything like that. So it's the same thing with these appointed feasts. That's how God uses them for Israel. But it doesn't mean that every nation in the world was supposed to practice the feasts of Israel before God had ever told anyone what they were. Otherwise, there would be no need to tell them, and no indication was given that these instructions had ever been given before they were given to Moses. So just to keep all of those things in mind, the seasons are when the sacred festivals would be held. In the sense the word frequently occurs, and it was right that at the very opening of his revelation, God should inform men that there were certain festivals which should be annually celebrated to his glory. But again, this is not giving detail of the law of Moses before Moses existed or anything like that. Some think we should understand the original word as signifying months, for which purpose we know the moon essentially serves through all the revolutions of time. And then the days, day and night are the differences, ruled over by the sun or moon. So when during daytime, the only luminary is the sun that anyone can see when the sun is fully up. And so it dominates the day sky. In the nighttime, the moon isn't always up, but when it is, it dominates the night sky. So that's what they're called. They dominate or are the most prominent in the day and night skies. And so we count days and nights by the sun, and we count months by the moon, and we can count years by the stars and the motion of the sun. And they're used together in the calendars. But I don't want to dwell on that too much. It isn't just a lunar calendar or just a solar calendar. You have to use them together. And the proof that people have always done this one way or another is that the seasons are unmistakable. You have spring, summer, winter, and fall without question, without fail in most of the world. Especially the Bible's focuses on Israel, so it matters what the seasons are in Israel, and they're still happening. And there's a verse in the Bible where God says that the seasons will continue until the very end. So that's how we count years more accurately, is by seasons, and it doesn't always match up with the sun precisely or always with the moon precisely. So we can go by phases of the moon, but we also have to consider the sun and the seasons. And that's what all these things are for. That's what they're signs of in Genesis. Okay, and you can read other commentaries. And this one, the Bridgeway Bible Commentary, tries to make excuses for the Bible not being a science textbook, to excuse ahead of time the fact that the Bible's description of cosmology do not match anybody else's. And the problem is that they're putting, as I've said the phrase many times, the Bible may not be a science textbook, but people treat science textbooks like they're the Bible. That is to say, they make the Bible bow to the higher authority, which is a science textbook. And so the Bible is made to be misinterpreted on that basis. So that excuse aside, they talk about the language of the Bible and the Creator's work and so forth. And then they get into, the whole creation week. And then we have Kaufman's commentaries and all sorts of things. But the point is that God made the sun, moon, and stars as signs of his provision and the annual, monthly, and daily cycles. The sky is a giant clock and calendar. That's what they're signs of in Genesis. Okay? So we can remember that this is the primary meaning in that context in Genesis. Okay? So now let's look at some more passages here. And also I chose the Net Bible because of the footnotes. I don't always agree with them, and I'm not the only one who doesn't always agree with them. There are scholars who disagree as well. But their note on Genesis 1:14, they make excuses as well, calling it pre-scientific. You'll find this word very prominent among Christians trying to make the Bible contort to science, so-called. They say the sun and moon are not in the sky below the clouds, but from the viewpoint of a person standing on earth, they appear that way. So take that as you will. But the point we want to look at is for signs and seasons, days and years. It seems likely from the meanings of the words involved that signs is the main idea, followed by two categories: seasons, days and years. Okay, so the signs are seasons and days and years. This is the simplest explanation and one that matches verses 11 to 13. It could even be rendered signs for the fixed seasons, that is, let them be for signs. Okay, and the signs are seasons and days and years. The point is that the sun and moon were important to fix the days for the seasonal celebrations for the worshiping community, but of course that's not all they were for, as it says right there in Genesis. But then look at Jeremiah 10:2. The Lord says, do not start following pagan religious practices. Do not be in awe of signs that occur in the sky, even though the nations hold them in awe. Is that something we could apply to the uncanny coincidences of the eclipses that are happening in the United States? And why is the United States significant in Bible prophecy? Now, there are a lot of Christians here. There are Christians in other places that are less prominent maybe in their societies or have been driven underground, which is happening here in the U.S. now. But the point is that the nations worry more about these things. Should we be concerned about them biblically? Are they signs, even though the Bible doesn't speak of eclipses, normal things that happen? But people are saying, well, look at this happened, and this happened, putting all the things together. And I've said before in prophecy videos that even though I don't agree with the methods by which some people reach a conclusion about some date they're trying to set, when all of the different methods meet at a point, we should at least pay attention. And so I'm not saying don't pay attention to these coincidences. I'm saying don't also be in awe or dread of them as the nations are, because the Bible doesn't say that any sort of eclipse is a sign from God. They happen all the time. Okay, so here we have an explicit word of caution in Jeremiah 10:2. Don't be concerned overly or distressed about signs in the sky, even though the unbelievers are doing that. So this is something we need to keep in mind. And then in Matthew 24 and Mark and Luke and similar passages we'll look at briefly, we have there will be signs, which is more about the focus of the title that I chose for this video. And he says starting in verse 29, Jesus is speaking immediately after the suffering of those days, or the tribulation, that's the older word. We can see that here in the footnote, traditionally tribulation. And going back here to this passage, it seems to have lost what I was looking at. I wish it hadn't done that. All right, we'll try this again and see if we can get our verses back. No, I don't want that in there. Sorry about this. Let me get my list of verses. Remind me not to click on a footnote again like that. All right, so we're going back down here to Matthew 24, starting in 29. Immediately after the suffering, tribulation, or distress of those days, the sun will be darkened. And remember, this is immediately after the tribulation. The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. And if we look down here for these notes, that's the safer way. They say it's an allusion to Isaiah 13:10 or 34:4 in the Septuagint and Joel 2:10. The heavens were seen as the abode of heavenly forces, so their shaking indicates distress in the spiritual realm. Although some take the powers as a reference to the bodies in the heavens like stars and planets, this is not as likely. That's their opinion. I'm just sharing it with you. So they're saying there's a little bit of nuance here that we need to be aware of. And so these signs in the sky may or may not be the stars and planets, but it says here that the sun is dark, the moon is dark, the stars fall from the sky, and some sort of powers up there will be shaken. And that we can't deny. So regardless of a little nuance in the note, but a point that's more important here is that these are all happening, as far as we can tell here, at the same time. Now, in an eclipse, in a solar eclipse, only the sun goes dark. The moon is already unseeable because it's new, and we don't even know for absolute certain that the moon is in front of the sun. You would have to track where the moon was last time you saw it, which is hard to do when it's a new moon, because the new moon is during the day and it's very close to the sun, obviously. So, but the point is that whatever the reason is for a solar eclipse, the sun goes dark, right? And in a lunar eclipse, the moon typically doesn't go dark, it goes red. But here it says they're both dark. Regardless, you can't have them both at the same time. They never occur at the same time, regardless of what theory you have for why eclipses happen or when, or what you do with the so-called impossible eclipse, the Selenelian eclipse. You can look that up. But the point is that these don't happen naturally at the same time. So if you're looking for a series of blood moons by themselves, you're not looking at a biblical sign of anything, because they're ordinary, they're predictable. The same with solar eclipses, but having both of them happen at the same time, that's a sign from God. That's extraordinary, miraculous, and has never happened before. The sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man arriving on the clouds of heaven with power and glory, and he will send his angels with a loud trumpet blast, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven, or the sky, to the other. It doesn't say from the earth. But just to give the context of this is all after the tribulation. But there are other passages that speak of these things happening before, or the moon turning to blood instead of being dark. But you have to pay attention to those little details. And then he goes on in verse 32, learn the parable of the fig tree. Whenever its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also you, when you see all these things, know that he is near, right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Now this kind of blends into the issue of preterism, which I've already done a video on, many videos actually, but the point we're concentrating on here right now is the first half of this paragraph. Looking at trees when they start to bud in the spring, which springtime is when I'm doing this, you know that summer is near. So when you see all these things, what things? If you look at what Jesus had been talking about just before the things we're quoting here, the tribulation. When you see all of that, Jesus is about to return with power and great glory. This is not the rapture. It's never described in these terms. And he's saying this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. Not even in 70 AD did all these things take place. They simply didn't happen. And if you say, well, they did, but you couldn't see it, that's not a special pleading fallacy, but an appeal to ignorance, or any number of other fallacies where you say, I just want you to believe it happened. There's no evidence that it happened. I don't think that's a wise way to interpret the Bible or any other writing for that matter. But it appears in this context that this generation refers to those who see the signs. Now, I've gone into this in much more detail about the fact that when Jesus was rejected by Israel, that all of these things were put on hold. And that's why certain other things didn't happen. People take that as a contradiction or as Jesus being wrong, but they don't understand the significance of Jesus being rejected. Anyway, that's not the topic today. The topic is that when you see these things, the tribulation and the sun and moon and these things happening, be ready because Jesus is about to return to the earth. But as for that day and hour, which one? The one we've been talking about, not the rapture, but the tribulation. No one knows it, not even the angels in heaven, except the Father alone. So it's when the tribulation is happening, nobody knows. Doesn't say anything about the rapture, but the rapture is also a signless event. So same difference either way. Now we have a similar passage in Mark 13. It says, in those days there will be suffering, just a different choice of words, unlike anything that has happened from the beginning of creation that God created until now, or will ever happen. You cannot describe 70 AD in this way. So the tribulation is a time of suffering never seen before and will never be seen again after it happens. And if the Lord had not cut short those days, the days of the tribulation, no one would be saved. But because of the elect whom he chose, he has cut them short. That is to say, probably his people Israel, because he has vowed to he made promises to Abraham that have not yet been fulfilled. And it's because of that, during this time, it says, then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe him, for false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and wonders. There's that word signs again. To deceive, if possible, the elect. That sort of thing happens. It's been happening for thousands of years, where there's false prophets, etc., and people claiming to be the Messiah. But Jesus is talking about those days. And they will also perform signs and wonders. And he says, watch out. And then again about those days in verse 24, after that suffering, after the tribulation. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then everyone will see the Son of Man arriving in the clouds with great power and glory, and then he will send the angels and gather the elect from four winds of heaven. So, saying the same thing here in Mark and in Luke, starting in chapter 21, verse 24, they will fall by the edge of the sword, not us, and be led away as captive among all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. I did a video on what the time of the Gentiles are, and that they began as soon as the throne of David was vacated, and they will not end until that throne is filled again during the millennium after the tribulation. And there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. What sort of signs? Something extraordinary, not ordinary things that have happened before, such as constellation alignments or certain comets or asteroids or whatever they want to say are going through those constellations in juxtaposition to other things like the sun and the moon. Those are ordinary things. They're predictable things. That's why they're not signs of the end times, but only signs that, as we saw in Genesis, signs of the seasons and the days and months and years. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars that are extraordinary, and on earth, nations will be in distress, anxious over the roaring of the sea and the surging waves. We talked about that at the start. People will be fainting from fear and from the expectation of what is coming on the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. If it were just as the net notes said earlier, that something's going on in the heavenly realms that we can't see, it doesn't make sense because of this. That people are afraid because of what they're seeing. And I'm pretty sure they won't be seeing into heaven. They will be seeing the sky. Then they will see the Son of Man arriving in a cloud. So this is, again, talking about the end of the tribulation. But when these things begin to happen, these portents in the sky and the sign of the Son of Man, stand up and raise your heads because your redemption is drawing near. People are going to say this is the absolute end. Even they survive somehow to the end of the tribulation, and they're going, woe are we, because we're all going to be destroyed now, if nothing else before this has worked for the rest of us. And Jesus is saying, primarily to Israel, don't give up at the end. I am coming. I promised, and I will come, as I said. Okay. Now let's look at this article in something called ucg.org. Are the blood moons indicating the end of the world? Are the 4 blood moon eclipses falling on biblical feast days in 2014-15 an indicator of the end time events, as some say? So this was written before the prior eclipse of the sun in the U.S. Or, any other eclipses that have to do with Israel. And that's where the focus should always be, what's happening in Israel, not what's happening in the U.S. Now, God could give a heads up to Christians in the U.S. Maybe that's all this is, but all we can say is maybe. We don't know. But don't be wowed by simply coincidences. But this is what they wrote before the last big thing about eclipses and signs in the sky. The short answer appears to be no. While there are many signs that we are in the last days, nobody disagrees with that, this does not appear to be one of them. Several evangelical ministries teach that 4 upcoming lunar eclipses in 2014-15 that can coincide with biblical festivals, along with 2 solar eclipses, could signify that important prophetic events are imminent. The idea emerged from thinking that the prophecy in Joel 2:31 of the sun being darkened and the moon turning to blood before, that's where Joel said before the end time day of the Lord, perhaps denoted solar and lunar eclipses, but again, that's not extraordinary. A lunar eclipse occurs only at the time of the full moon, when the moon's orbit places it on the opposite side of the Earth from the sun. That's what I don't care about their explanation why. And a solar eclipse only occurs at the new moon when the moon is invisible. So that's why they can't happen at the same time normally. Anyway, lunar eclipses are actually rather common. There were 229 in the 20th century, 81 of them total eclipses. So in trying to find some significance among them, attention was turned to a relatively rarer occurrence, a lunar tetrad, a series of 4 total lunar eclipses spanning 2 years, with 6 lunar months from one eclipse to the next. And it was noted that even more rarely, the eclipses in such tetrads at times correspond to the spring festival of Passover and the autumn feast of Tabernacles. Yet, this is perhaps not so remarkable as it sounds. Always keep checking, like I keep referring to Proverbs 18, verses 13 and 17, where it says, to judge a matter before verse 13 says, to judge a matter before you hear it is folly and shame. And then verse 17 says, the first to speak or present their case always seems right until another steps forward and cross-examines. We don't do our cross-examination. We have to do that. So people aren't doing that when they hear these theories that sound so good on the first time you hear it. Excuse me. Biblical months begin at the new moon, when solar eclipses can occur. And the festivals of Passover and Tabernacles always occur at the time of the full moon, when lunar eclipses can occur. Indeed, when many lunar eclipses fall at the time of Passover and Tabernacles every century. And those feasts are exactly 6 lunar months apart, just as needed for tetrads to fall. Of course, tetrads of eclipses can fall across any months that are 6 months apart. In the 20th century, there were 5 lunar tetrads, 2 coinciding with biblical feasts. However, some centuries have more or less or even none. Between years AD 1 and 2000, there were 54 tetrads, of which 7 corresponded to the feasts. While that might sound extremely rare, 7 of 54 is about 13%, close to what random average would yield. The 7 tetrad periods, and they give the years of those. Some have seen a tie-in here to major events in history of the Jewish people. They note that in 1492, the Jews were expelled from Spain, and Columbus allegedly discovered the New World, which would later become a haven for them. In 1948, the Jewish state of Israel was born, and in 1967, the Israelis defeated their enemies in Six-Day War. However, note that the associated tetrads followed these events, sometimes by a year or more. So how did they herald or announce ahead of time these things? And that's what signs are for. You can't call it a sign if it's something you already passed. Nobody reads a road sign that says you passed New York half an hour ago or 50 miles ago or anything like that. Signs point to what's coming. Moreover, there were no monumental events attached to the first 4 tetrads. Consider also that the most significant events in Jewish and world history have no tetrads associated with them. From 100 BC to AD 100, there were no lunar tetrads, feast-related or otherwise, and it was in this period that Jesus Christ lived and died and was resurrected. The New Testament church began, and Jerusalem was destroyed. No tetrads. Why? We should also note that these feast eclipses don't always exactly correspond to biblical festivals. Sometimes they fall a day or 2 off from the festivals as they fall on the Hebrew calculated calendar. As for the 2 solar eclipses in 2015, the first, a total one on March 20th, this is, again, before these things happen, is supposed to correspond to the first day of the sacred year, Nisan 1, on the Hebrew calendar, but it actually comes a day before on Adar 29. The second eclipse, a partial one on September 13th, comes not on Tishri 1, the Feast of Trumpets, but on the day before, Elul 29. This is to be expected since a solar eclipse comes at the exact conjunction of the sun and moon, they say, when the moon is invisible to us because they say its dark side is facing us. Anyway, while the new moon or the month on the Hebrew calendar comes shortly after when the first crescent is visible. The March 20 solar eclipse, again, this is prior years, will be visible in the clear skies only in the far North Atlantic and Arctic oceans, while the September 13th one was visible only in the area around Antarctica, with the sun not much dimmed because it's not a total eclipse. Neither will be visible from the focal point of biblical prophecy in Jerusalem. In fact, of the lunar eclipses in the 2014-15 tetrad, the first three will not be visible from Jerusalem at all. Only the last will be visible from there if the skies are clear, less than half of it as the moon sets on the horizon. As to Joel 2:31, it mentions the sun being darkened and the moon turned to blood, but nothing about this happening 4 times in a row. Both have to happen. Indeed, the passage must refer to more than mere eclipses. The previous verse mentions blood and fire and pillars of smoke, which seems a logical way for the sky to be obscured and the moon to be reddish-colored, as if, for example, happens during a volcanic eruption. Verse 10 shows devastation darkening the sun and moon as well as the stars, the latter of which would not be darkened at all by eclipses. In Matthew 24:29, Jesus said the heavenly signs would occur immediately after the Great Tribulation, as we've noted, and Revelation 6:12 and 13 shows them following that time of martyrdom of God's people after the seal judgments. So there's a third time in prophecy timeline, and immediately preceding the day of the Lord, as we mentioned before. And that's a reference also to Revelation 6:17. And so the solar eclipses and lunar tetrad of 2014-15 did not fulfill, and nothing happened, these prophecies of the sun being darkened and the moon turned to blood, because that great tribulation has not even started, much less concluded. Some, admitting this, still maintain that the tetrad must indicate something big. Yet the first 4 feast eclipses of those listed above did not seem to indicate anything, and those claimed to be associated with major events concerning the Jewish people came, for the most part, after those events, which in parallel would mean that big events associated with the 2014-15 tetrad would have already happened, though the Six-Day War came between the first 2 eclipses of the coincident tetrad. The world is poised for major events. We see them all the time. Many false flags, etc. So significant events might well happen in the 2014-2015, but there is no way to know what they would be, if anything, on the basis of lunar tetrad. So, what should we do with what happened or didn't happen in the last solar eclipse over America regarding the one that's going to happen, supposedly? Now let's look at this last site here, Our Blood Moons, a Sign of the End Times. And I need to harp on this because it's so common for people to forget everything they heard and just go, wow, look at all those tetrads. Some believe solar eclipses and blood moons are omens that the end of days is near. Are these ideas a misinterpretation of Bible prophecy? I think we know what the answer is already. And they're looking back at it now. In 2015, some religious groups became convinced that a tetrad of blood moons coinciding with the biblical holy days was a sign heralding the end of days. Of course, the 4 blood moons, lunar eclipses, came and went with nothing significant occurring. Though the religious fascination with blood moons has died down to some extent, and I think it's rising a little bit now because of this eclipse, there are still some small religious groups who proclaim certain lunar phenomena are end-time harbingers. On January 31st, 2018, so this is written before 2018, there will be another total lunar eclipse over part of the Earth. So the one was 14-15. This is the one before 18. There are some groups claiming such natural, predictable, regularly occurring events point to God's impending judgment on the world. When you hear or read these kinds of warnings, should you take them seriously? Could naturally occurring astronomical occurrences fulfill end-time prophecies and be signs of God's judgment and the end of the world? No doubt about it, astronomical signs are prophesied to occur in the end times leading up to Jesus Christ's return. But are solar and lunar eclipses the signs of heaven that these prophecies refer to? Let's look into the scriptures for answers. And so we already know the answers, but we're going to look at what this article says. God has used darkness in major events such as the ninth plague on Egypt and during Christ's crucifixion. Some Christian leaders have used these examples to justify the idea that God uses eclipses. That's all they need, and they run with that. But let's have a look at these events more closely. The ninth plague of Egypt. The plague that caused darkness throughout Egypt was not a solar eclipse because eclipses only last minutes or sometimes seconds. The darkness over Egypt lasted 3 days. The Israelites were not affected by the darkness. Their darkness was not an eclipse, but a special miracle performed by God. There's your sign in the sky, not an eclipse. And the darkness at Jesus' crucifixion. The Gospels describe darkness covering the land during Jesus' crucifixion. And the passages are Mark 15:33, Matthew 27:45, and Luke 23:44. A careful reading of these scriptures shows the darkness started in the 6th hour in Jewish reckoning of time, noon, and ended in the 9th hour, 3 p.m., so for about 3 hours. Again, this is way too long for a solar eclipse. In addition, Jesus died on the Passover, the 14th day of Abib, or Aviv in the Hebrew calendar, which always occurs when they say when the earth is between the sun and moon. Whether that's the cause or not, who cares? But we know the patterns, and they say the solar eclipse can only occur at a different time, and we've gone over that. Since these past events don't indicate God uses natural astronomical occurrences and biblical science, what about future events? So then we look to the sixth seal of Revelation. As already mentioned, Bible prophecy does foretell future heavenly signs. In Revelation 6:12, the opening of the sixth seal causes this. The sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood. And compare Joel 2:31. This is the main verse that has led some to believe recent astronomical occurrences are end-time markers. But does this prophecy describe an eclipse? And again, they talk about the mechanics of such a thing. It's not really important here. But per the note they have here, the real heavenly signs will be global, worldwide, unmistakable, and totally unnatural. Anyway, so Revelation 6:12 cannot be referring to a solar or a lunar eclipse because in order for it to be both, both would have to occur at the same time, as I've said before. Furthermore, this event is accompanied by other heavenly signs. So it is not just a dark sun and a red or dark moon, but also stars falling from the sky. I don't care what they think they are. They try to make naturalistic explanations, but the Bible describes it. John giving the revelation, passing it on what he was told to write, said it's like when a strong wind shakes a fig tree and the overripe figs drop to the ground. That's how he was describing the way the stars were falling. Not like shooting stars, not like meteorites, or whatever those are. Anyway, not like that. This is a different falling. This is not a shooting star. It's a falling star coming straight down. That figs blown by the wind aren't going to go across the sky. They're going to come straight down and they drop to the ground. I don't care what anybody wants to do with that. It's what the Bible says. The real heavenly signs will be worldwide, unmistakable, unnatural. They will be caused by God's direct intervention, not the natural alignment of anything. The heavenly signs will mark the beginning of a prophetic time period called the Day of the Lord. These heavenly signs, not the naturally occurring ones. This future time period will be preceded by other prophetic events that have not yet transpired or come to their fullness. A summary of the events are religious deception, wars and rumors of wars, worldwide famines, worldwide pestilence. And the issue that happened in 2020 was, in my opinion, a test run of a man-made calamity that some would say that was a plague of the Bible, and it does not fit the description because it's not supernatural. These first four are called the beginning of sorrows in Matthew 24:8. Even though we see these signs represented in the world trends today, they will reach greater intensity in the future. They will be accompanied by these other signs in the heaven, both and. So when the sun goes dark, the moon goes dark or blood red, and the stars fall from the sky to the earth, and then you see all these other things, the pestilence and all that stuff, which happens after the revealing of the Antichrist, which has not happened yet. You got to keep these details in mind when you read these things. And they go on here, they're followed by other events such as hostile persecution against God's true people, whatever. I wouldn't say church here, it's not the term used, but his chosen or elect, which doesn't always mean the body of Christ. And the abomination of desolation is the key to the midpoint of the 7 years, per Daniel 9:27, and Matthew 20:14 is where that lines up, and I've gone over these details in prophetic videos. Matthew 24:21 indicates these events are all connected with the Great Tribulation. The heavenly signs mentioned earlier occur immediately after the tribulation, corresponding to they say the sixth seal. I say the sixth seal is not at the end. There are multiple times when these things happen. So even though I think they're a little confused, they say, don't be confused. Eclipses and blood moons do not correspond to any prophesied biblical event. We can agree on that. They occur as a result of the way God created and aligned everything. The Bible specifically warns us to not be worried about celestial alignments. We read that in Jeremiah 10:2. Don't be fooled by so-called end-time prophecy experts who claim eclipses and blood moons are prophetic signs. Now, that's not what J.D. Farag is claiming. He's just saying, look at these coincidences of the names of these towns called Nineveh across the U.S. Eclipses and blood moons are interesting to study and watch, but hold no prophetic significance. Life, Hope, and Truth is the name of their website. Will continue to help you understand world events, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so I'm hoping what we've learned today is that we can't just take a snippet of a biblical verse and run with it and listen to everybody who comes along in social media or whatever, promoting and hyping people up, especially Christians, that this means something, only to have us embarrassed once again after a gazillion times we never learn. The point being that the Bible doesn't say there will be normal, ordinary eclipses that happen to draw an X on a certain country in the West that the Bible doesn't even talk about. Are they signs for us only? The Bible doesn't say it, just to be clear, but is God trying to get our attention? I hope so. He's tried it many other ways. If he doesn't have our attention just by how bad the world is, I don't know what would work. Maybe this, I don't know. I just know that it is a predictable event, and that's something we need to keep track of. Of course, again, you could say, look at all those towns named Nineveh. And on the previous one that helped make the X, I think there were towns called Salem or something, which is part of the name Jerusalem. But the point again is nothing happened the first time. Will something happen now that the X is being drawn? And since the X occurs over the New Madrid fault line in the U.S., maybe that will trigger a giant earthquake. There was a giant one in the 1800s. That didn't do as much damage as it will this time. It's going to go off sometime. I don't know when. But people are worried that this X, which, how does a solar eclipse cause the Earth to shake? I still haven't figured that out. If anything did happen then, if whenever the New Madrid goes off or the caldera out west, what I call the Ring of Fire around the Pacific Rim. Any one of those has a major event. The other two are likely to have one as well. And if these events happen in the United States, especially the New Madrid fault line runs kind of along the Mississippi, which splits the country traditionally into east and west. And if you have the caldera out west that also goes off at that time, the U.S. will probably not exist anymore. I mean, it will be torn apart literally, physically. That can happen. But whether it's a prophetic sign, I don't know. Or a prophesied event in the Bible, I can't find it because there's nothing about the Western world in the Bible. The only terms are when it talks about worldwide events, which it talks about in Revelation. Those are to come in the tribulation. Other than that, we can't be any more specific. So, the moral of the story is the signs in the sun, moon, and stars that are predictable don't tell you anything but what a clock and a calendar would tell you. Whether they draw over a 7-year gap, an X on the ground in a place the Bible doesn't mention, may or may not be significant. But don't worry about it one way or another. I mean, even if it did cause the United States to be split apart, what are you going to do to prepare for that? Seriously. As I've always said, the best preparation, the best prepping, spiritual prepping, is what you want to do. Because whatever happens, you need to be tight with God. You need to belong to Him. And there's an explanation of the gospel and the description of my videos that this is an offer of adoption, of being made right with God through faith in the Jesus who rose from the dead. There is no other way. It's simple but not easy for people because you have to humble yourself and accept this gift on the basis of the eyewitness testimony and hostile witness testimony that Jesus rose from the dead. That is the one singular event in world history that I believe is as established as any other, and that this is the only way you can prep for what's coming. You don't want to be an unbeliever during the tribulation. And of course, even a believer will suffer greatly, and there will be a mass martyrdom of Christians during that time because people love to have scapegoats for the bad things that are happening, and they will shake their fists at God because, as I've said before, by the sixth seal, they know it's God doing these things, and they want to hide from Him. And they know it's the God of the Bible because they also say, hide us from the face of the Lamb, for the day of their great wrath has come, and who can withstand it? So, by the sixth seal, everybody knows that the God of the Bible is raining down judgment, and they will either hate Him for it or turn to Him. So, that's what's going on. Yes, there's going to be the eclipse of 2024 coming up as the time of this recording. I'm preparing to watch it and hopefully get some video, watch it safely, and we'll see you on the other side. But again, don't worry. If you're a Christian, and if you're non-Christian, probably nothing will happen, but I don't know. I can't guarantee. Things can happen. The rapture and then the tribulation and the Antichrist can happen at any moment, and the conditions of the world are ripe for that. So, thanks for listening.